Hey, how's everybody doing? It's Tom again. I have a little story I want to share with you. It's another food for thought segment. I noticed when I sent the last one up to the group, I only had one in there, so I had to have at least two. This is the second food for thought segment that I'll be doing here on January 29, 2012. This is actually a story that I previously had on Gay Talk Radio, now known as Queer Public Radio. It's a piece that aired back on February 3rd of 2009. I've actually modified and enhanced it a bit for this reading. Yeah, I hope you enjoy it. The title of it, and of course these names have been changed because this is a true story. It's titled A Girl Named Betty. Goes like this. In the mid to late 1979, I met a cigar-smoking woman on the CB radio. 10-4, good buddy. But we ain't talking your normal smoking tobacco, if you know what I mean. 1979. For this story, I will call her Darla. Back in those days, I wasn't so proud of my God-given sexual orientation, and I didn't really notice Darla wanted more than just friendship. You see, when a person inhibits their natural sexual desires, they inhibit more than just one aspect of it. For this reason, the friendship between Darla and myself only lasted a mere couple years. Her father was a city councilman in a small town near San Antonio, Texas. He mentioned me to the chief of police. I got an interview with the police department, and thankfully, I ended up being a police dispatcher. And that was the start of my experiences in law enforcement. Darla had a friend named Betty, who she introduced me to. Betty was kind of a country girl, to put it mildly. I remember the first time I met Betty. Darla and her pulled up next to the police station in an old car that didn't have a passenger seat. It was Betty's car. It was a Mustang, I think. And Darla was sitting on a sack of seeds on the passenger side. Country girl. Betty had a husband and a son at that time. Her son, I'll use the name Dirk. He was probably 2 or 3 years old when I first met him and his mother. His father wasn't around much because he worked on the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. So he would be gone for weeks at a time. One day, Darla let me know her intentions regarding me. She wanted to develop a relationship with me beyond friendship. I was left with no other choice, and I had to tell her I was gay. Luckily, she didn't say anything to her father. The news didn't get out. Darla met another guy, married him, and off they went. I kept my job on the police force. Betty and I became pretty good friends. She was fun to be around and didn't seem to have a problem with my sexual orientation. Of course, you have to remember at the time I was in the closet, so it really wasn't much of an issue. Perhaps a year or more went by. Betty ended up leaving her husband. They had a separation. She and her son, Dirk, came and lived with me. I still remember to this day, almost every day when I was going to work, being a policeman, I had to put on all that stuff. And as I put on my police uniform, Dirk would come into my room because he was still learning to talk at the time, and new words, were coming to him. Every day it seemed like he was learning new words. So he wanted to know the words. He wanted to watch me get dressed. So I would tell him when I put it on. Gun belt, extra bullets, handcuffs, gun, nameplate, collar, and other assorted insignia. After a while, he was naming everything all by himself. pretty smart kid. I remember one time I went off to work. Dirk wasn't around that week, as I remember. He was with his father. They were separated. Betty somehow got the bright idea to handcuff herself to the couch. Unfortunately, she didn't have a handcuff key. And I was at work, so she was stuck there until I came back home, which was many hours later. When I arrived, she was fit to be tied. Literally, pun intended. Of course, I couldn't stop laughing. And that didn't help the situation whatsoever. During those many hours, she couldn't reach her cigarettes, couldn't reach the phone, the remote control for the TV, or go to the restroom. And that was her biggest point at that time, was to go to the restroom. So you can understand how she just didn't appreciate my response. After a few months of staying with me, Betty and her husband got back together. At the time, I kind of patted myself on the back for that. But in a way, looking back on it now, I sort of regret that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You know, next thing you know, they were back together and she was pregnant again. With that birth, she would give birth to twin girls. Times got rough for them, and the family ended up leaving Texas with their 3 children and him and her, and going to Louisiana, where her husband's family had a little land. The years passed, and it was now 1985. I had left the police force. I was out of the closet and had my first lover. We decided, my lover and I, to visit the World's Fair in New Orleans that year, 1985. It just so happened that Betty lived about 2 hours from there in Louisiana. And so we arranged to stay at her place. I was surprised when we arrived because her husband wasn't there. She told me he couldn't find any jobs in that rural area that they lived in, so he went to Dallas to find work, Dallas, Texas. So she added that he would send for the family when he had saved up enough money. Now, I don't remember how long she said it had been that he had been in Dallas, but it had been too long. Betty talked me, and in turn my lover, into taking her and the kids and their belongings back to Texas. We were coming back to San Antonio, so Dallas was just a few hours extra drive for us. So we hooked up some old horse trailer to the car and filled it up with their belongings, and off we went. Upon arrival into the Dallas area, we were unable to locate her husband where he was supposedly staying. So we ended up taking her and her kids and their stuff over to her mother's house, who she lived in Irving, Texas, which was a border city of Dallas. It turns out that her husband was living with another guy in an apartment and was busy going to gay bars every night. Of course, this explains why he couldn't save up enough money to send for the family. Betty asked me if I thought she should stay with him. I told her that was not a decision I could make for her. I could only tell her that if she truly loved him and him her, that the two of them probably should try everything they could to keep together. Betty and her husband would try everything they could, such as joining swinging couples clubs and having three-ways and many different things before the eventual end of their relationship. Her husband finally told her he was gay and had to live his gay life. Their split up broke Betty's heart. She was so distraught, and he was so busy exploring his new life, they decided to send the kids back to Louisiana to live with their grandmother. Betty became involved with the wrong crowd, and she ended up going to prison. Her husband didn't fare much better. It wasn't long before he was HIV positive. Not too long after learning his positive status, he became a little bit on the ill side, too ill to care for himself, so he ended up moving back to Louisiana with his mother and his children. During that time, his mother suggested that she become the guardian for the children. This was still in the late 80s, so he was not long for the world. His mother suggested she become the guardian for the children, the guardian. So Betty's husband approached her about it during one of his visits to the prison. During one of his visits to the prison. So Betty signed the papers. Of course, this wasn't the legal way to do it, because Betty's mother-in-law had some legal friends. And she made it happen. Betty's husband passed on, and when she got out of prison, she was only allowed supervised visits with the children. Seems her mother-in-law, again with her connections, blah, blah, blah. And practically she had brainwashed the children regarding Betty. How terrible Betty was. That Betty had abandoned them and was a terrible mother. Dirk, the son, being raised by the same mother as his father, was ending up with some similar issues. Dirk wanted to speak with me on a couple occasions, but was denied a way to contact me. Dirk asked his mother how she would feel if he was gay. Dirk said he would like to speak with me about it. His mother would not give him my phone number or instructions on how to get to my house. He was too young to remember. Evidently, he had a similar conversation with his grandmother, and her response was something like, "You watched how your father died. Do you want that?" Dirk ended up living on the streets at New Orleans at one point. Finally, he was forced to go back to his grandmother's house to live. A couple years later, I think he was in his early 20s, Dirk drove his car at a high speed into a tree. The impact was so great, the engine was found over 100 yards away from the point of impact. Dirk did not survive. I believe it was suicide. Of course, the family and his mother blame it on drunken driving. The twin girls both had early pregnancies. And I believe one of them had, or maybe both of them had an abortion. And they had some problems with STDs as well. Betty has now found religion in the Bible. At one point, she started to preach to me from the Bible. I told her I wasn't going to listen to her ramblings, and she stated, "I put up with your homosexuality all those years, and now you won't listen to me?" Betty and I no longer speak. There is no silver lining in the story, but it is factual and it is true. It is my hope and desire that it somehow speaks to some individuals or individual, and by doing so, that it may offer some healing or help in some way. It seems all this must have happened for a reason. I'm hoping that reason is to help others. Much love to all. Thank you for listening.